Hello, and welcome to Off the Fence, a podcast where we deconstruct difficult decision making to try to figure out what keeps us stuck, and more importantly, how do we get unstuck? I'm your host, Karen Covey, a former divorce lawyer, mediator, and arbitrator, turned coach, author, and entrepreneur. With me today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Jenn Kennedy. Dr. Kennedy is a clinical sexologist and licensed marriage and family therapist based in Santa Barbara, California. In her private practice, Dr. Jenn sees couples and individuals in the areas of relationships, sex, addiction, and LGBT. In 2019, she founded her clinical group practice, Riviera Therapy, and under this umbrella, she supervises up and coming clinicians. In 2023, Dr. Jenn launched the Pleasure Project, which is dedicated to helping us all have a better sex life. Through this venture, Dr. Jenn hosts a podcast called The Pleasure Project with Dr. Jenn Kennedy, and she offers small group intensives for women and couples called The Pleasure Circle. Dr. Jenn has been quoted in Redbook, Reader's Digest, Forbes Health, Daily Ohm, Shondaland, Parade, Allure, Yahoo Life, and others. She's often tapped to discuss intimacy and sexuality for therapists and physicians. Dr. Jenn, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It is great to have you. And I'd like to start at the beginning, so to speak. I mean,
Yeah.
becoming a clinical sexologist is not, well, it's not something that most young kids aspire to be, right? So
hmm
what got you into this practice? How did you get to where you are now?
Yeah, definitely. I started doing other things first. Was a, Initially I was a publicist, then I was a photographer. I did each of those for a number of years. And, in college I had seen a therapist and I found that intriguing. It was always sort of in my back brain to be a therapist. And I literally went back to grad school at 40. I was like, I had always wanted to do this. It was like this sort of secret desire. And then I started going down that path, really wanting to be a couples therapist because I had also done that work as a couples, um, had gone into couples work. And then as I got deeper into couples work, I realized that there was so little information about sex. Like that is just such a gap in our training. And nobody wants to touch it. Nobody wants to do the couples sexuality piece of it. And I realized there is such a need. There is such an opportunity. When as a business person, like when you see a niche that is like, it's there's a reason for it, but also there's an opportunity for it. So I went toward it. And initially, I just took a little bit of coursework and then I really did a deep dive and I did a whole PhD in it. And it's been great. That's what makes it a sexology is that I did a PhD. So, yeah.
Wow, I noticed in your bio you said that you also train other therapists and physicians in
Mhm.
intimacy and sexology. And I'm so curious, what don't therapists know about sex? Because you just mentioned you get very
Mhm.
little training on that, and people go, their marriage is in trouble. Often sex is a
Yeah.
part of that. They go to just a regular couples therapist, expecting
Yeah.
that person to be able to fix everything. Can you talk a little bit about that and why that might or might not be a
Yeah.
good idea?
A normal LMFT gets one course in sex. That's the human sexuality course. Typically, like in my program, it was the last quarter within the 2 year master's course is human sexuality. And that is a very cursory pass on sex, right? It's sort of a kind of a redo of what you got in your basic human sexuality course that you got in high school. It's a bit of anatomy, it's a bit of like what happens, but it's not sufficient at all. I taught that course. Actually, I've taught that course at the master's level. Like I know what that course is supposed to be, but in terms of actually like understanding desire discrepancy, trying to do a deeper dive in terms of what happens relationally, what happens as we go through the life cycle, what happens at different stages, for couples, what happens when there's injury, what happens when there's sex abuse, what happens, there's all these different scenarios that therapists are not equipped to really handle because they just don't know. There's just a lot of different scenarios when there's religiosity, when there's high anxiety, when there's erectile dysfunction that happens because of biology or medication. Like there's just all these different scenarios that we're not educated to address. So that's what happens when you get more advanced training.
Wow, there is so much in there that I want to go into now. So you just mentioned desire and desire discrepancy. What is
Mm-hmm.
desire discrepancy?
So that is when you have two people that have different desire levels. So, which is usually what presents like one person wants it a lot more than the other person does. So there's a discrepancy in terms of desire.
Okay, why would that be? I mean, don't aren't all humans born with the same biology? Don't we all want the same thing?
No, no, of course not. Like, think about, I mean, even the same two people that sometimes want sex but they don't want it on the same day at the same time, right? It might be one might be having backache, one might be having a bad mood, one might be having resentment, one might be having body image issues. There's like a whole host of reasons. I like to look at it through like the lens of biological, psychological, interpersonal, right? There's those kind of three big kind of categorical things that can impact. Biological would be say that you're having I mean it could be as broad as like if you're having blood flow issues, if you're having medication issues, that type of thing. So there's medical issues that would be causing issues that are having problems that would interrupt. Psychological issues might be things like if you're having depression or anxiety or those types of things, that take you out of the game. And then relational issues, if you're carrying resentment, if you're having distrust, say you've had a fight earlier in the day, or if there's been infidelity or those types of things, there's relational breakdown, right? And it could be for both of you, it could be for one of you. So all three of those things could be happening in the same relationship, or one or all three of those things could be happening for one person or both people. So there's so many variables that could be happening at any one time. So that's why when I sit down with couples, it's like, okay, let's do a recap. And does the couple even agree on what's happening? Because oftentimes they're not even seeing the the relationship the same way.
That's interesting, right? Because
Yeah.
one person, if you've got this desire discrepancy, which is something that happens a lot that I get from my clients sort of secondhand. Like they're not coming to me for sex therapy, but it's like, yeah, our sex life has died a long time ago, or, my
Mm-hmm.
wife never wants to have sex, or my husband never wants to, whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
So when that happens and there's this desire discrepancy, how do you deal with that?
Mm-hmm. It Well, first of all, you have to have two people that even want to deal with it, right? You have to have buy-in there's got to be buy-in that they both even want to address it. Because if one person is dragging the other person in, it's not really going to go anywhere. So you've got to first of all have two humans that are assuming that two humans are the unit of treatment as opposed to more, but two humans that want to deal with it is number one. And if they're both on board, then what what is the nature of the problem? When did it start? When does it happen? Trying to establish sort of get our arms around what's going on, um, and then start to unpack what might we do about it. Because trying to interrupt the cycle of what's the problem, when does it get better, what might we do about it. Um, Typically, couples can go back to an early period of time where things were better, and if we can source from that, maybe what makes it better, because usually they can look at the beginning and things were better sexually. They can
Right.
remember when things were just easy, it was natural, they wanted to like get together, they had spontaneous desire for one another. um, what was going on then? There were less obstacles to desire. So sometimes we can source some of that and have it happen. We can remove some of the obstacles that seem to get in the way. We can also plan. You know,
Okay,
remove some of the obstacles and plan some of the things.
that sounds so unromantic.
I know. It's funny. Some people are very opposed to planning, and then some people are like really practical about it. I find that I'm okay with either, right? If one person's a planner and one person's not, then I say the planner person plans it and the spontaneous person doesn't have to know about it, and then it feels like it's spontaneous to them, right? And that's okay.
Okay.
Right? And then it
Okay, why
happens
not?
and they think it's just spontaneous. But yeah, it's like you know, in a long-term relationship in particular, things start to feel very familiar, and sometimes that starts to feel very boring. And so there sometimes you have to be kind of practical about it, and a willingness has to come in to sex in particular, right? There has to be a willingness to approach this with some intentionality.
Well, let's talk about that because, especially in a long-term relationship or a long-term marriage,
Mm-hmm.
whichever it happens to be, um, what what kind of advice or tips could you give to a couple that like their relationship is floundering, sex is a part of that, and
Mm-hmm.
they want to zip things up again. They don't want a divorce. They don't want their relationship to die. They want sex, but
Yeah.
they're bored. Like what can they do? What's the first thing that they should try? Should they go to someone like you? Are there, the things that they can do, exercises, or I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
but what should they do? What's their first step?
Well, what I will say is anything new starts to wake the brain up a bit. And so seeing each other with any sort of contextual change is interesting. So if they went to a new place, if they brought in a new thing to read, if they went on a date to a place they've never been, if one of them brought in a new toy, anything is like, "Hmm, what's that?" Right? But if you go to the same bedroom and you start it the same way and you do it at the same time, it's like boring. It's
Yeah.
so familiar. But if you do anything different, even if you introduce like a new piece of lingerie, anything, the brain's like, what's that? you know, like it likes some piece of newness, and it doesn't, even if it's perfume, like, right? There's just anything new. You like it yourself, and typically your partner's like, wait, that's different. What's that? You know? So if even if you approach differently,
Hmm.
like I was thinking we might try this new thing. It's like, what? Okay. Right? The brain starts to kind of
Yeah.
respond, and gets a little like, because there's a little bit of nervousness in that because it's different, but there's also a little bit of excitement in that. So if if that feels like something you can manage as a couple, or if there's a willingness to do that, there's lots of ways to prompt. Esther Perel has a wonderful card set that can give some prompts. There's external ways that you can get ideas for that. There's certainly I have a course that kind of help with that too. There's external ways, if you as a couple can manage that. There's coaching, there's ways to do that. But yeah, see if you can try to introduce some of that into your relationship, because I think it makes a difference. And I think if you're both committed to it, don't get lazy, don't get complacent in your relationship, because yeah, it doesn't feel fun.
Well, what happens if you've got a couple and they've hit that complacent stage, right? Their
Mhm.
things aren't fun, they're not exciting. They've got into the land of meh, right? Everything is meh.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
one person feels like they can't do this, like they've had enough, they want the change, and the other person is comfortable. Can the person who wants the change, is that enough? Can they insert enough newness and new enough vitality that as long as the other person will go along, can reignite the relationship? Or do both people have to be actively working at this?
I would wonder if the person that's igniting the change would start to feel resentment, or if it feels like enough that they at least have a co-conspirator, that's willing to accompany. I mean, oftentimes in many relationships, I would say, older, like above 50 years old, kind of and up, men historically have been the instigators. They've been more the initiators. And so they've taken on that role. Um, so is that such a foreign concept? No. Um, but as long as they have receptivity, as long as their partner is interested. So I don't know if one person, as long as there's interest and there's receptivity, maybe that's okay. It's
Okay.
always kind of what the couple, whatever they negotiate is fine by me.
It sounds like it's worth a try, right?
Hmm.
For somebody listening, if
I
they're
like, yeah, I like to see that there's some sharing in it. I think it's fun because I think it feels nice if both people are taking some of the reins and having, because it's just like gift giving, right? If sometimes somebody's giving you a gift and it's a gift of concept, or it's a gift of like, I've thought about us or about you, and I thought that you might like this gift of experience. And it doesn't have to be every week, but occasionally it's kind of nice to not have to come up with the whole plan, you
yeah,
know?
I can see that. Well, and you mentioned age, right? How important is sex in an intimate relationship, especially as we age? Because so many people in our
Hmm.
society just assume, oh, you're over X years, whether that's 50, 60, 70, whatever the age is in their head, you just don't do it anymore. You don't need it anymore. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I see couples into their 80s and they're still having sex for sure. I think that sex, okay, first of all, I define sex much more broadly. I wouldn't say that it has to be penetrative sex. I would say sex becomes a lot of things. It's touching, it's kissing, it's can we say all that on this?
Yeah.
I'm like, are we allowed to say all
You
those
just
things?
did, so you're okay.
Okay. Yeah, it doesn't have to just be traditional penetrative heterosexual sex, right? Sex is just the whole kit and caboodle, like of sex, sexuality, and because especially postmenopausal women sometimes are having pain with penetrative sex. That skin gets thinner, lubrication becomes more difficult. So, and sometimes erections become more challenging for men too. So if we can, just work with what we've got and let sensation, let pleasure be the driver. I think it can just be so much better because it becomes anxiety producing when things don't work like they used to. And so if if we can just be looking for pleasure instead and let that be the driver, then I think sex should be on the table and can be really nice if it can be more broadly defined.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that even just defining it that broadly has a
Mhm.
sense of taking the pressure off. Like, oh, I don't need to be able to do this one thing one way, right? If you widen your definition, life
Yeah.
becomes infinitely easier, I would think.
Yes. It's like we have erogenous zones all over the place. And so much of so much of sex is really honestly not even about that one moment of like orgasm. It's about connection. I think um it's about power sometimes. It's about play. It's about a lot of things. And so it doesn't have to just be this one thing. And a lot of times women aren't even enjoying it that much when it's about penetration. Ding, ding, ding. Did you hear that? Wait, what? So if we can broaden it and have it be about a lot of other touching and options, I think it's going to go better anyway, you know?
But yeah, I understand as a woman completely, but for men, it's such an important part of their identity, right? And
Mhm.
so as they age, or especially if you mentioned sometimes there's an injury or there's medication or there's something else
Mhm.
involved that makes having an erection or sustaining it or whatever, it makes it more difficult. They kind of lose their way. They don't, so what
Mhm.
would you, if somebody came in, if a couple came in and let's just put it on the man. The man has some sort of medical condition that makes what we would call traditional sex difficult for him, how can
Hmm.
you not just shift what he can do, but shift his identity around this is sex too? You know, do you understand what I'm asking?
Hmm. Hmm.
How do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's statistically higher and higher. Like as they get into 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, it's going to statistically get higher and higher that they are going to have difficulty achieving and maintaining erections. So it's going to happen. So it's a conversation I have a lot of, hey, it's okay, it's super normal, and you can still have like sensation, so you can still have pleasure. Either, are you willing to have touch? Are you willing to have um you can still have oral sex, you can still have touch, you can still have, you know, other ways. Are you willing to have that? Are you so attached, and are you yeah, it's like your ego is really getting in the way here. And I actually had a I had a conversation with a guy the other day, and I said, okay, so you're kind of bummed out because your erections aren't what they used to be. I said, would you rather have chronic lower back pain, or would you rather have, you know, like the erections that you're having? And he said, he thought about it for a second. He said, I'd rather have the erections that I'm having. And I said, okay, that's what I thought. Right. Like,
I love that. That's such an interesting question. I would never have thought to phrase it that way.
yeah,
You know,
it's
and
like, come on, everybody's got their something. And, it's like, it's still sort of working, and it's just, it's fine. It's okay. Like you know,
well, how do you get, so all right, so let's say you've got one person who's got these issues, like either whether
hmm.
it's a woman who is having more pain with intercourse because she's getting older, or a man who has erectile issues because he's getting older, right? And what happens to one person affects the couple. How do
Sure.
you counsel the couple to maintain a connection in spite of whatever medical issues are going on?
Yeah. It's interesting because if like one of them broke their leg, or if one of them, had some other medical thing, they would totally treat it normally, right? But because it has to do with genitals and it's not as visible, or well, I mean, I guess an erection is visible, but it's like they treat it differently. I don't know. It's this, like, we don't talk about it, or we don't want to acknowledge it or something. I just wish they'd be more practical about it. It does affect the coupleship, and yet it's not game over. They still have sensation, they still have desire. This is like the biggest sexual organ is their brain. And so I really try to just normalize it. Like, it's okay. And with a woman too, hormones are super helpful. Lube is really necessary. Lubrication diminishes as we age. And lubrication is necessary anyway. Like, right, women lubricate in the beginning, but then as sex persists, not just age wise, but in general, lubrication is necessary. Um, but vaginal lubrication and vaginal hormones are necessary in general as we age. And so just helping kind of all that stay healthy and comfortable. Like, we need to be comfortable, And so
Yeah.
just taking the shame out of that, because I know there's just a lot of misinformation. And so helping couples advocate for themselves and communicate and have it be a fun thing, and not feel like you're suffering through it, or just trying to get it over as quickly as possible, because hopefully that's not the approach. And so having the communication feel open and flowing. And so it's interesting because we spend years and years together as couples, and yet there isn't always a lot of good open communication in this realm. And so if it's not comfortable, then it makes sense that there isn't a lot of desire happening. And so, yeah, it always mystifies me that people don't feel like they want to say what's actually true, and yet they sort of hide the ball on this topic. And so, you know it's no
Yeah.
wonder that they don't feel a lot of desire, but they also don't want to hurt their partner's feelings, but then they also feel like, you know
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot tied up into this. It's not like I
Yeah.
like how you take the approach, sort of a multi-tiered approach,
Hmm.
because there's a lot of components to
Hmm.
sex. There's a lot of components to desire, to this whole issue. But and that leads me to my next question, which may sound like a silly question, but how important is sex in a relationship? I mean, can a couple be totally sexless and totally happy?
Yes, I would say yes.
Okay.
Yes. And I've, yeah, if they are both on board for that, they're not in my office probably.
Yeah.
But, you know, I've definitely seen that happen. I know people in my life that have that happening. It's fine. It's sort of like what I often ask, one of the first questions is like, what is the function of sex for you? Like, why, what is your why for sex? Because if you don't have a why, then we're not going to find a how. We have to understand, because if sex is about, you know, proving something to each other, or if sex is about, you know, if you don't have a why and it's just because you think you should, then this is going to be such an uphill battle, and we're going to be just suffering through this.
Mm-hmm.
And that's no fun for anybody. And every week you're going to dread coming here. If this is something where it feels empowering and it feels like a treat and it feels exciting, because right now, I've got this couple that are so fun. Every time they come in, they are delightful. They giggle. They're like, they're both just so sweet to each other. And they're in their like early 60s. And they're just like, I can't believe we get to do this. And they're so much fun to work with because they feel delighted to get to do this work. That is such a contrast to most couples that are coming in at that point. And so if you are in that space, great. But if you don't want to do this, you don't have to, you know? So yes, I think you can have a really great functioning relationship without sex. But most people want sex. And I think it's a bonus. I think it's a benefit,
Yeah,
but you don't
I
have to have
have
it.
a, I've talked to a lot of people who their relationship has been sexless for a long time, but not by mutual agreement, right? That it
Hmm.
just they either stopped having sex, or one person wants it, the other one doesn't, or there's relational issues on so many other levels that sex is sort of, they can't. Here's a question for you. I've talked to people who one person in the couple, let's say we'll say the guy wants sex, but the woman has such relational issues, like she's so angry with him over
Hmm.
other things that have nothing to do with sex.
Yeah.
When he goes to touch her, she goes, "Oh," and she has a physical
Yeah.
reaction that she doesn't even want to be touched by him. How do you start to
Yeah.
deal with that kind of dynamic so that they can get back to the place where, they were having sex like rabbits when they just started, as a couple?
Yeah. Well, so those are just the regular run of the mill relational issues. Like that's LMFT stuff, right? That's the that's the interpersonal stuff that she needs to unpack and say, I am feeling a ton of resentment about, is it you don't carry your share of the load, or like I don't feel respected, or is it tone, the way you talk to me, is it, you
Mm.
didn't follow through. So it's literally just.
But where do you start working on or unpacking that kind of thing? Because from the man in that scenario, from his perspective, the problem with the relationship is she doesn't want to even be touched. She doesn't want sex. She doesn't want intimacy. From her perspective, there's relational issues that are causing all of that. So how do you start to work with the couple so each
Mhm.
one can dig down beyond what's on the surface and seems to
Yeah.
be the problem to get to what's really the problem?
Yeah. It's interesting that there's like sort of a wheel that I see oftentimes, and this is pretty common, is men will say, I need intimacy to enter into the relational piece. And women will say, I need the relational piece to enter into intimacy. And it's
Yep.
like, you can enter this at either point. but it's really, those are really common entry points by gender. And I don't know exactly why, but they're just very common. And so I would explain that to them as a couple and say you each, have to. And so his touch needs aren't being met, but her relational needs aren't being met. And I would probably start with maybe explaining some of the relational pieces, and having him give some acknowledgement. And then maybe if she's willing to give him a hug or some touch needs, maybe not sex needs, but something, if each of them could give a little bit, because depends on the nature of sort of like where have each of them broken down. And if there can at least be some intellectual acknowledgement of where they've each been withholding, that's kind of a starting place. That's kind of like where it begins, because these things tend to happen on very subtle levels, and then in relationships, and then you're 5 years down the road and you're both really dug in, and you've been moving in your silos in this relationship. It's amazing how people do this. Do you remember War of the Roses? Right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
And then you're like, how did we get here?
Yeah, it's
Right?
swinging from the chandelier, literally.
Right. It's like unbelievable how
When
how people do it. Yeah.
when a couple gets to that point, maybe not swinging from the chandelier, but they've been siloed, as you put it, for years.
Mhm.
Is there hope? Can they find a way to come back together, or is there such a thing called the point of no return?
I've had a few couples call it quits in my office. That has definitely happened. I cannot be more committed to the relationship than they are. Like, I'm not there to make sure that they stay together. I cannot be. But also, if they are in there, and I'm also surprised sometimes that people stay together, because I'm like, really? You two? Like, really? You don't make a lot of sense to me, but there's a reason they chose each other. And I'm always a little bit shocked at, kind of the pairings that happen. Um, but they're choosing each other because there's something in that for them. That combination, they're drawn together. And oftentimes people are choosing someone that fulfills something that they are lacking and that they are drawn to, because they're intrigued by something that's different.
Hmm.
And I definitely see that happen too. And so even if they're at odds, there's something that is drawing them in. And yeah, I think there's history, and there's an affinity. I think you can always look back and see at anyone you've dated for a long-term period of time, and there's a reason that you chose them to begin with, and you can still tap into that. Um, so yeah, I think there's hope if somebody can soften and give some acknowledgement, and I think with with proper coaching or therapy, that you can get there. It's just, can people change? And people can change if they're willing and interested in that, you know?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I had a coach on once, a sex researcher and coach who said that his big thing was the oxytocin track, and that he,
Mm.
according to his experience, if he could get a couple to sit and just touch each other, hold hands, maybe hug, maybe look into each other's eyes, that, if they committed to doing that much every single day for 2, 3
Mhm.
weeks, they
Like
could
humanize
change.
each other.
Yeah, they could change the relationship. What do you think about that?
Mhm. I tried that a few times. It's super awkward. Oh my gosh. It breaks down some barriers for sure, because if couples, I've actually found when couples are squabbling and they just are like, "Rah, rah, 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 rah," and they won't stop. I've actually had them do that, where I'm like, literally don't talk for 60 seconds. 60 seconds. just just look at each other, and while they're looking at each other, I'm doing like a little track of overlay, humanizing them. This is the person who feels fear, this is the person who loves you, this is the person who wants to work things out, this is the person who, like, and they start crying. They're like so emotional while they're doing it. So remind them that this person is someone who matters, when they can like stop their own like defensiveness. But so I have done that somewhat successfully. I don't do it much because clients tend to hate it. It's not really my style. It's a little more Sue Johnson. That's not really my style so much, like EFT. But yeah, it's an avenue in. It's just not my style so much. Yeah.
Is it something that a couple can do? Because it sounds like what you were just describing is happening in your office, in your presence. Is this something that a couple can do and make it work when it's just the two of them? Or would it just add to
Hmm.
resentment?
Well, yeah, like I think if you are hitting an impasse where you're just going at it and you aren't making progress, then you take it to the nonverbal and you're basically trying to tap into your like help your nervous systems regulate is probably what he's trying to do. So, that would be a long hug, or that would be, the holding, or that would be co-regulation through breathing. Yeah, that makes sense to me that that would be helpful. Um, yeah, I could see that because then you're not trying to like talk you into anything, It's like your
Hmm.
brains aren't going back and forth. You're just taking you're down regulating. Yeah.
You just said something interesting, co-regulating through breathing. What's
Hmm.
that?
Um, so well, okay, think about we do it with children, right? Where when a baby's crying and you
Hmm.
pick them up and you just hold them, right? You're like bouncing the baby, you're holding the baby, you're co-regulating, you're helping them regulate through holding and through breath breathing. We do it intuitively with children. You could do that with a partner too, right? If somebody's upset, you're holding them, you're breathing, you're helping them calm down,
Interesting.
right? So rather than talk to them and tell them to calm down and stop being so upset and you're being ridiculous,
Right.
come here, just hold them, right? There's something very calming to that action.
That's
And
interesting.
that's the co-regulation. We co-regulate also through tone, right? Slowing our voice down, taking dropping our tone a little bit, slowing our words down, eye contact, blinking slower. Like we do it with animals, we do it with children, we can do it with our partner too, right? Everything, like we're animals at the end of the day. And so we do it with each other. The way we talk, if I talk faster and I get bigger, you're like, yikes, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
with our partner, if we slow it down, we know it sort of intuitively, but if we do it intentionally, it feels different.
That makes so much sense. That really does. Before we get too far afield and have to wrap up, I also wanted to talk to you about the groups that you do. Is it called the Pleasure Circle?
Mhm.
Tell me more
Yeah.
about that. What's that?
Yeah. So, okay. So I've been doing sex therapy with individuals and couples. And I was seeing just the same thing come in over and over. And then also I did my dissertation. So I kind of boiled down that information and I created this curriculum. That's the Pleasure Circle. So it's a 6-week program, and I have usually about 6 to 8 women in that program. And it is magic. It's pretty cool. Each week it's 90 minutes. It's online, and it's live, and I've got a program of like each week I do about 20 minutes where I give kind of a lecture. Then I give some writing prompts. And people are writing, kind of applying the information to themselves, and then we talk about it. We all kind of have a open discussion and kind of talk it through and unpack it. So and then I give some podcasts in between, and so it's just sort of this workshopping thing that we do, and so it really accelerates the information. It really helps women that are in this place that want to sort of skyrocket through, like where are they? It's for women who are looking to understand their own desire, to get on board with their own sexuality, and to if they're having low desire, or if they've always kind of wanted to understand their sexuality or kind of reclaim their sexuality. So yeah, so I run those a few times a year. I'm also going to do a recorded version that'll be coming out this coming year.
Wow, this has been fascinating. It really has been because
Yeah,
and like you said, I'm very, very glad that you came on and that you talked about this because this is a topic that's kind of taboo. Like it affects so many people, but very few people are willing to work with people in this arena and talk about it so openly. So I just want to thank you for coming on and
yeah,
sharing everything that you've shared on this podcast. It's been wonderful.
yeah. It's been fun.
So do me a favor to tell our listeners or watchers, whoever's watching or listening to this, where they can find you if they want to learn more.
Sure. So you can go to pleasureproject.us. That has all the information, my podcast, my blog, my pleasure circle, articles, all that good stuff. You can find it there. Pleasureproject.us.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Dr. Jen, so much for being here. And for those of you who are watching and those of you who are listening, if you enjoyed today's topic, if you want more, interviews just like this, do me a big favor. Give this a thumbs up, like, subscribe wherever you're watching, and I look forward to seeing you again next time.